The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Captain Maria stood before the tactical briefing board, her jaw set in determination as she studied the aerial photographs pinned across the surface. The images showed a narrow valley cut deep into the mountainous terrain, with a single bridge spanning a rocky gorge. Intelligence reports indicated that an entire enemy armored division was preparing to cross that bridge within the next 48 hours, and if they succeeded, the entire defensive line would collapse. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as senior officers debated strategies. Maria had been flying combat missions for 18 months, longer than most pilots in her squadron, and she had developed a reputation for precision that bordered on the impossible. Her flight records showed an accuracy rate that made even the most seasoned veterans shake their heads in disbelief. But today, the mission planners were proposing something that seemed beyond even her capabilities. Colonel stood at the front of the room, his weathered face grave as he outlined the situation. The enemy had positioned their tanks in a convoy formation that stretched for miles along the approach to the bridge. Standard bombing runs would be ineffective because the valley was too narrow, the targets too spread out, and the anti-aircraft defenses too dense. What they needed was something different, something that would require flying skills that most pilots simply did not possess. Maria listened intently as the colonel described the plan. There was a massive concrete column supporting the bridge, a cylindrical structure approximately 15 feet in diameter that rose from the valley floor to connect with the bridge deck above. If that column could be destroyed, the entire bridge would collapse, trapping the enemy armor on the wrong side of the gorge. The problem was that hitting such a narrow target from the air, while flying at combat speed and evading anti-aircraft fire, was considered virtually impossible. The room fell silent when the colonel asked for volunteers. Maria felt every eye turned toward her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the tactical map. She knew what they were thinking. She was the only pilot in the squadron who might have a chance of pulling off such a shot, but even for her, the odds were astronomical. The margin for error was non-existent. A miss by even a few feet would mean the bombs would explode harmlessly in the valley and the mission would fail. She stepped forward without hesitation. The colonel looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He had known Maria since she first arrived at the airfield, a young woman barely out of flight school who had insisted on flying combat missions despite regulations that attempted to keep female pilots in training roles. She had proven herself time and again, but this mission was different. This mission could decide the outcome of the entire campaign. The planning session lasted for hours. Maria pored over every detail of the valley topography, studying wind patterns, calculating approach angles, and memorizing every landmark that might help her navigate through the narrow confines of the gorge. The bridge column was located in a particularly treacherous section where the valley walls rose steeply on both sides, creating unpredictable air currents that could throw off even the most carefully aimed bomb. Her navigator, Lieutenant, worked alongside her, plotting the flight path with meticulous precision. Was a mathematics prodigy who had been assigned to Maria's crew specifically because of his ability to calculate bombing solutions faster than anyone else in the squadron. Together, they developed a plan that required flying through the valley at an altitude so low that the wingtips would pass within meters of the rocky walls on either side. As evening approached, Maria walked out to the flight line to inspect her aircraft. The twin-engine bomber had been her companion through dozens of missions, and she knew every rivet, every control surface, every quirk of its personality. The ground crew had already loaded the bombs, specially selected armor-piercing weapons designed to penetrate concrete. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingertips, and whispered a silent prayer to whatever gods watched over pilots in wartime. That night, sleep came fitfully. Maria lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling of the barracks and running through the mission profile in her mind. She visualized every second of the approach, every adjustment of the control yoke, every correction she would need to make for wind and turbulence. She had developed this mental rehearsal technique early in her flying career, and it had served her well. By the time she climbed into the cockpit, she would have flown the mission 100 times in her imagination. The other pilots in the squadron treated her with a mixture of respect and concern. They knew the odds she faced, and they knew that if anyone could succeed, it would be Maria. But they also knew that even the best pilot could be defeated by circumstances beyond their control. Anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, simple bad luck, any of these could turn a precisely planned mission into a tragedy. Dawn broke cold and clear, perfect flying weather. Maria arrived at the briefing room to find that the mission had been expanded. Intelligence had updated their estimates of the enemy armor strength, and the numbers were staggering. More than 200 tanks were now confirmed to be moving toward the bridge, along with countless support vehicles, artillery pieces, and infantry transports. If this force crossed the gorge, it would have the firepower to break through the defensive positions and reach the strategic railway junction beyond. Stakes had never been higher, and Maria felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She accepted it without complaint. This was what she had trained for, what she had fought for the right to do. When others had doubted whether a woman could fly combat missions, she had proven them wrong. When they said she lacked the strength to handle a heavy bomber, she had demonstrated skills that surpassed most of her male counterparts. Now she would show them what true precision looked like. The pre-flight briefing covered every contingency. Weather forecasters predicted that conditions would remain stable for the next 6 hours, giving Maria a window of opportunity. The enemy's advance scouts had been spotted approaching the bridge, which meant the main force would begin crossing soon. Timing was critical. The bridge had to be destroyed before the tanks began their crossing, but not so early that the enemy would have time to construct an alternative route. Maria walked to her aircraft at her side. The ground crew had painted a special marking on the nose, a small symbol that represented precision and accuracy. It was their way of showing confidence in her abilities, and she appreciated the gesture more than she could express. She climbed into the cockpit, settled into the familiar seat, and began the pre-start checklist. The engines roared to life, their powerful drone vibrating through the airframe. Maria tested the controls, checking each surface for proper response. Everything felt right. The aircraft was ready, her crew was ready, and she was as prepared as any pilot could be for a mission of this difficulty. She glanced at, who gave her a confident nod, then advanced the throttles and began her takeoff roll. The bomber lifted off smoothly, climbing into the morning sky. Maria turned toward the mountains, following the route they had planned so carefully. The flight to the target area would take approximately 40 minutes, time she would use to continue her mental preparation. She flew with the kind of focused calm that came from years of experience, making minor adjustments to maintain optimal altitude and airspeed. As they approached the mountain range, Maria descended to a lower altitude to avoid detection by enemy radar. The terrain became more rugged, with jagged peaks rising on all sides. She threaded her way through the valleys, using natural features to mask her approach. This was dangerous flying that required constant attention, but it was necessary to maintain the element of surprise. Called out navigation checkpoints as they passed each landmark. They were exactly on schedule, following the flight plan with precision. Maria could see the tension in his movements as they drew closer to the target area. This mission would test both of them in ways they had never been tested before, and there would be no second chances. The radio crackled with reports from reconnaissance aircraft that had been monitoring the enemy column. The tanks had begun moving toward the bridge, their advance faster than anticipated. Maria calculated quickly and realized they would reach the target area with only minutes to spare. She pushed the throttles forward, coaxing more speed from the engines while maintaining the low altitude that kept them hidden from enemy observers. Ahead, she could see the distinctive profile of the mountains that marked the location of the bridge. Her heart rate increased slightly, an involuntary response to the approaching danger, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She had trained herself to channel nervousness into heightened awareness, using the adrenaline to sharpen her senses rather than allowing it to cloud her judgment. The valley entrance appeared before them, a narrow gap between towering walls of stone. Maria descended further, dropping to an altitude that made grip his seat nervously. They were committed now. Once they entered the valley, there would be no turning back, no room for evasive maneuvers. They would have one chance to line up on the target, release their bombs, and escape before the anti-aircraft guns found their range. She banked the aircraft into the valley entrance, feeling the turbulence immediately. Air currents bounced off the rocky walls, creating invisible rivers of force that tried to push the bomber off course. Maria fought the controls, making constant corrections to keep the aircraft centered in the narrow space. The valley walls rushed past on either side, so close that she could see individual rocks and crevices in the stone. Hunched over his bombing site, making final calculations. The bridge column should be visible soon, and they would have only seconds to acquire the target, compute the release point, and execute the bombing run. Maria's entire world narrowed to the view through the windscreen and the feel of the controls in her hands. Every other thought disappeared, replaced by pure concentration. Then she saw it. The bridge appeared ahead, spanning the gorge with elegant defiance. And there, rising from the valley floor like a sentinel, stood the concrete column. It looked impossibly small from this angle, a slender pillar that seemed far too narrow to hit with bombs dropped from a fast-moving aircraft. For a brief moment, doubt flickered through her mind. Then she crushed it ruthlessly and focused on the task at hand. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around them, black puffs of smoke marking where shells exploded in their path. Maria ignored them, maintaining her course with iron determination. The aircraft shuddered as a shell burst nearby, close enough to rattle the airframe but not close enough to cause damage. She kept flying, her eyes locked on the target. His voice cut through the chaos, calling out corrections. Maria made minute adjustments to her heading and altitude, trusting his calculations completely. They had worked together long enough that their coordination had become almost telepathic. She knew what he needed from her flying, and he knew exactly what she was capable of achieving. The target grew larger in her vision, the concrete column now clearly visible against the darker stone of the valley floor. Maria could see the bridge deck above it, could see the road leading to the bridge, could even see tiny figures of enemy soldiers manning the anti-aircraft positions. Time seemed to slow as her brain processed information at superhuman speed, calculating angles and distances with instinctive accuracy. His hand moved to the bomb release switch. Maria held the aircraft steady despite the buffeting from turbulence and the continuing barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Her muscles ached from the strain of maintaining such precise control, but she refused to let the aircraft deviate even a fraction from the required course. Everything depended on the next few seconds, on her ability to hold position long enough for to execute the perfect release. The column filled her forward vision now, growing larger with every heartbeat. She could see details in the concrete, could see where weather had stained the surface, could see the joints where sections had been poured. It was both massive and fragile, a critical point of failure in the bridge's structure that, if destroyed, would bring the entire span crashing down. The moment released the bombs, Maria felt the aircraft lift slightly as the weight dropped away. She maintained her heading for 2 more heartbeats, giving the weapons time to begin their trajectory, then pulled hard on the control yoke to begin the escape maneuver. The bomber climbed steeply, engines roaring at full power as she fought to gain altitude before the anti-aircraft gunners could adjust their aim. Behind them, the bombs fell through the air in a precise pattern. The calculations had made, combined with Maria's perfect flying, had created the ideal conditions for accuracy. The first bomb struck the concrete column exactly where the structural engineers had identified the weakest point, just above the foundation where the massive pillar met the bedrock of the valley floor. The armor-piercing warhead penetrated deep into the concrete before detonating, and the explosion sent cracks racing through the material like lightning through a dark sky. The second bomb hit fractionally higher, widening the damage and compromising the column's structural integrity even further. The third and fourth bombs, released in rapid succession, completed the destruction. The massive concrete column, which had stood for years supporting the weight of the bridge above, began to fail catastrophically. Enormous chunks of concrete broke away and tumbled into the gorge below, and the entire structure started to lean at an impossible angle. Maria was already pulling out of the valley when she heard excited shout. She risked a glance back and saw the bridge beginning to collapse. The column had failed exactly as the engineers had predicted, and without that critical support, the entire span was folding in on itself. Steel girders twisted and broke, the roadway surface buckled and cracked, and within seconds the entire structure was falling into the gorge in a cloud of dust and debris. The anti-aircraft fire ceased abruptly as the enemy gunners realized what had happened. Maria leveled off and turned back toward their base, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. She had done it. Against odds that most experts had considered impossible, she had hit the target with devastating precision. The bridge was destroyed, and the enemy armor would not be crossing the gorge. The flight back to base seemed to take forever. Maria flew on autopilot, her mind still processing what had just occurred. She had executed hundreds of bombing runs during her time in combat, but nothing compared to this. The difficulty of the shot, the importance of the mission, the incredible pressure of knowing that failure would have catastrophic consequences, all of it combined to make this moment unlike any other in her career. When they landed, Maria found the entire squadron waiting on the flight line. Word had already reached the base through radio communications from forward observers who had witnessed the bridge collapse. As she climbed down from the cockpit, the other pilots crowded around, slapping her on the back and shouting congratulations. Colonel pushed through the crowd, his normally stern face split by a broad smile. The celebration was cut short by an urgent message from headquarters. Reconnaissance flights had confirmed that the bridge destruction had trapped the enemy armor on the wrong side of the gorge, but that was only the beginning. Intelligence analysts had been studying the enemy's deployment patterns, and they had identified something significant. The tanks that had been heading for the bridge were not traveling alone. They were part of a much larger force that had been assembling for a major offensive. Maria was called to an emergency briefing where senior commanders laid out the new situation. The enemy had positioned their armor in multiple staging areas throughout the region, preparing for a coordinated assault along a 100-mile front. The destruction of the bridge had disrupted their timetable, but it had not eliminated the threat. The tanks were still there, still ready to attack, and they would find alternative routes if given enough time. The commanders presented Maria with a proposal that seemed almost insane. They wanted her to conduct a series of precision strikes against the enemy armor concentrations, using the same techniques she had employed against the bridge column. The difference was that instead of hitting a single target, she would be attacking multiple locations over several days, each mission as dangerous as the last. The logistics were staggering. Each strike would require flying deep into enemy territory, navigating through dense anti-aircraft defenses, and hitting targets with the kind of accuracy that left no room for error. The enemy would be on high alert after the bridge attack, which meant the defenses would be even more formidable. Most pilots would have considered such a campaign to be a suicide mission, but Maria saw it differently. She understood what was at stake. If the enemy armor was allowed to complete its assembly and launch the planned offensive, the defensive lines would be overwhelmed. Thousands of lives depended on stopping those tanks before they could attack. The fact that she was being asked to shoulder this burden alone was both terrifying and strangely appropriate. She had proven she could hit targets others considered impossible to strike. Now she would have the opportunity to put that skill to use on a scale that could change the course of the war. The planning for the new campaign began immediately. Intelligence officers brought her photographs and reports detailing the enemy positions. The tanks were concentrated in several locations, each one carefully chosen for tactical advantage. Some were positioned in open areas where they could quickly deploy for the offensive, while others were hidden in wooded areas or behind natural terrain features that provided concealment. Maria studied each location with intense focus, looking for the specific details that would make each attack possible. She needed to identify approach routes that would minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, determine the best angle of attack for maximum effectiveness, and calculate the precise timing required to catch the enemy tanks while they were vulnerable. It was like solving a series of complex puzzles where every variable mattered and every mistake could be fatal. Her first target was a tank concentration located in a broad valley approximately 60 miles behind enemy lines. Intelligence estimates placed at least 30 tanks in this location, along with support vehicles and supply dumps. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft batteries around the perimeter, creating a defensive umbrella that would make a conventional bombing run extremely hazardous. Maria decided to attack at dawn, when the low angle of the sun would make it difficult for the anti-aircraft gunners to acquire targets. She would approach from the east, using the sun at her back to further blind the defenses, and she would come in low and fast to minimize the time the enemy would have to react. Worked out the bombing solution, calculating the exact point where they would need to release their weapons to achieve the desired impact pattern. The night before the mission, Maria wrote letters to her family. She had developed this habit early in her combat career, writing messages that would be delivered only if she failed to return. It was a morbid practice, but it gave her a sense of closure, a way of saying the things that needed to be said just in case. She wrote about her pride in serving, about her belief that what she was doing mattered, and about her hope that someday people would understand why she had chosen this path. The mission launched before dawn, with Maria's bomber lifting off into darkness. She climbed to altitude and set course for the target area, flying through the pre-dawn gloom with practiced ease. The aircraft hummed beneath her, engines running smoothly, all systems functioning normally. She allowed herself to relax slightly during the transit, conserving her energy for the intense concentration that would be required once they reached the target. As the eastern horizon began to lighten, Maria descended to attack altitude. The valley where the enemy tanks were concentrated appeared ahead, a long depression between rolling hills. She could see the tanks now, dark shapes arranged in orderly rows, preparing for the day's operations. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could imagine the tank crews going about their morning routines, completely unaware of the death approaching from above. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as soon as they detected her approach, but Maria had timed her attack perfectly. The sun, just rising behind her, created a blinding glare that made accurate aiming nearly impossible. She flew straight and level, giving the stable platform he needed for his bombing calculations. The aircraft shuddered as shells exploded nearby, but none of the fragments found critical systems. Called out the release point, and Maria felt the familiar sensation of the bombs dropping away. She immediately banked hard to the right, turning away from the target area and accelerating to escape speed. Behind her, the bombs fell toward the enemy tanks with mathematical precision. The first explosions erupted among the parked vehicles, creating massive fireballs that rose into the morning sky. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks ruptured and ammunition cooked off in the heat. Maria climbed for altitude, looking back to assess the damage. The valley was engulfed in smoke and flame. Counted at least 15 direct hits on tanks, with several more vehicles burning from secondary effects. It was a devastating strike that had caught the enemy completely by surprise. The anti-aircraft fire followed them as they retreated, but Maria flew with the confidence of someone who had already accomplished her mission. Back at base, the intelligence officers were jubilant. Reconnaissance photos confirmed that Maria had destroyed or severely damaged more than 20 tanks in a single attack. It was an unprecedented success that demonstrated the effectiveness of precision bombing when executed with sufficient skill. But there was no time to celebrate. 3 more enemy concentrations had been identified, and Maria was expected to attack them in rapid succession. The second mission launched the following day, targeting a tank formation positioned in a forested area near a major road junction. This attack would be more difficult because the trees provided natural concealment for the tanks and made visual acquisition challenging. Maria would need to rely on navigation skills to find the exact location, then execute a bombing run based primarily on calculated coordinates rather than visual confirmation. They flew the mission in, approaching the target from an unexpected direction to avoid the heaviest anti-aircraft defenses. Maria descended below the tree line, flying just above the forest canopy in a white-knuckle display of low-level aviation. The trees rushed past below, close enough that a slight error in altitude would send them crashing into the branches. Called out the release point based on his dead reckoning navigation, and Maria dropped the bombs without ever actually seeing the target. The results were spectacular. The bombs penetrated the forest canopy and exploded among the hidden tanks, creating a storm of fire and destruction. Reconnaissance flights conducted later that day confirmed 18 tanks destroyed or damaged, along with numerous support vehicles. Maria had successfully attacked a target she could not even see, relying entirely on navigation precision and mathematical calculation. The third mission targeted another concentration, positioned near a railway siding where the enemy was loading supplies. This attack presented unique challenges because the tanks were spread over a wider area, requiring Maria to make multiple passes to cover the entire target zone. Each pass would give the anti-aircraft gunners another opportunity to find their range, increasing the risk with each successive run. Maria decided to vary her approach on each pass, coming from different directions and altitudes to keep the defenders off balance. She made 4 separate bombing runs, each one executed with the same precision as her previous attacks. By the time she turned for home, 22 more tanks had been destroyed, and the railway siding was a smoking ruin that would be unusable for weeks. The fourth concentration proved to be the most difficult target yet. The enemy had positioned their tanks in a narrow canyon where the walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural fortress that was heavily defended. Maria studied the photographs for hours, looking for a weakness in the defenses. She finally identified an approach route that would take her through a series of smaller canyons before emerging directly above the target. Flying through the twisting canyons required every bit of skill Maria had. When they emerged above the target canyon, Maria had only seconds to acquire the tanks and begin her attack. The enemy defenders were caught completely by surprise, having never expected an aircraft to approach from that direction. She rolled inverted and pulled through a split-S maneuver that brought her down into the canyon in a steep dive. The maneuver was dangerous and unconventional, but it positioned her perfectly for the bombing run. Worked frantically at his bombing site, adjusting calculations on the fly as Maria's wild maneuvering threw off his initial solutions. He called out a new release point, and Maria dropped the bombs while still in the dive. She pulled hard on the stick, hauling the bomber out of its descent with such force that the airframe groaned in protest. The bombs impacted among the tanks below, and the confined space of the canyon the explosions, creating a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. Reconnaissance later confirmed 25 tanks destroyed in that single attack, the highest count yet. The enemy's armor concentration had been decimated, and the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. What had been planned as a massive offensive now looked like an increasingly desperate defensive effort as the enemy struggled to cope with the loss of so much armored capability. Between missions, Maria barely slept. She spent her time studying intelligence reports, planning future attacks, and maintaining her aircraft. The ground crew worked around the clock to keep her bomber in perfect condition, knowing that even the smallest mechanical problem could prove fatal on missions of such extreme difficulty. They treated the aircraft with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects, understanding that it was the instrument through which Maria was changing the course of the war. News of her achievements spread rapidly through the military. Other pilots spoke of her in tones of awe and disbelief. Some called her the Angel of Precision, others referred to her as the Tank Destroyer. The names didn't matter to Maria. She focused on the work, on the next mission, on the next target that needed to be eliminated. She understood that every tank she destroyed meant lives saved on the ground, soldiers who would not face impossible odds when the battle came. The enemy began adapting to her tactics. They dispersed their remaining armor more widely, making it harder to achieve the kind of concentrated destruction she had inflicted in earlier attacks. They moved their anti-aircraft defenses more frequently, trying to make her approach routes unpredictable. They even established dummy tank positions designed to draw her attacks away from the real concentrations. But Maria adapted as well, working with intelligence officers to distinguish real targets from decoys and developing new attack profiles that kept the enemy off balance. Her fifth major strike targeted a heavily defended position where the enemy had assembled what intelligence believed to be their last significant armor reserve. The location was a fortified compound surrounded by multiple rings of anti-aircraft positions. Previous reconnaissance flights had drawn intense fire, making it clear that the enemy was expecting another attack and had prepared accordingly. Maria knew this mission would be different from the others. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a deadly game of tactics and countertactics. She would be flying into the most heavily defended target she had yet encountered, and the enemy would be ready for her. The question was whether her skills would be sufficient to overcome defenses specifically designed to stop her. She developed a plan that relied on deception and timing. She would approach the target from the most obvious direction, drawing the attention of the anti-aircraft defenses, but at the last moment she would break off and circle around to attack from an unexpected angle. The maneuver would require split-second timing and incredible flying precision, but if successful, it would catch the defenders looking in the wrong direction. The mission launched at midnight, an unusual time that itself was part of the deception. The enemy would expect her to attack at dawn or dusk, when the light favored offensive operations. By attacking in darkness, Maria hoped to gain a few crucial seconds of confusion before the defenders could respond. She flew without navigation lights, using moonlight and her instruments to navigate through the darkness. As she approached the target area, Maria descended to an altitude so low that could see individual trees passing beneath them in the moonlight. The defensive perimeter appeared ahead, marked by searchlights sweeping the sky in coordinated patterns. Maria timed her approach to coincide with a gap in the search pattern, slipping through the outer defenses before the lights could find her. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as soon as they detected her presence, but their shells exploded where they expected her to be, not where she actually was. Maria had already begun her evasive maneuver, turning hard away from the target as tracers arced through the sky around her. The defenders followed her turn, swinging their guns to track her path and convinced they had her trapped. Then Maria reversed course with a maneuver so violent that thought the wings might tear off. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and came around in a split-S that brought her back toward the target from a completely different angle. The defenders, still tracking her previous course, were caught completely by surprise. By the time they realized what she had done, Maria was already lined up for her bombing run. The compound filled her forward vision, and she could see the tanks arranged in neat rows within the fortified walls. Called out corrections, and Maria adjusted her course with tiny movements of the controls. The anti-aircraft fire intensified as the defenders finally located her new position, but she was committed now, flying straight and level through a storm of steel. The bombs released in a perfect pattern, falling toward the compound with lethal precision. Maria pulled up hard, engines screaming at full power as she clawed for altitude. Behind her, the bombs found their targets. Massive explosions rippled through the compound as armor-piercing warheads penetrated tank hulls and detonated ammunition stores. The night turned to day as fuel tanks exploded and burning debris was thrown hundreds of feet into the air. Counted the explosions, his voice excited as he tallied the hits. At least 30 tanks had been struck directly, with many more damaged by secondary explosions and flying debris. It was Maria's most successful single attack, achieved against the most formidable defenses she had yet encountered. The enemy's last armor reserve had been shattered, and with it went any hope of launching the planned offensive. The flight back to base was tense as Maria nursed the bomber through several system failures caused by battle damage. Shrapnel had punctured fuel tanks, damaged hydraulic lines, and knocked out several instruments. She flew by feel and experience, coaxing the wounded aircraft home through sheer determination. When they finally landed, mechanics counted over 40 holes in the airframe, any one of which could have been fatal if positioned slightly differently. Colonel met her on the flight line, his face a mixture of relief and concern. He had been listening to the radio communications during the mission, hearing the anti-aircraft fire in the background, and wondering if this would be the mission from which Maria would not return. But she had survived, and she had achieved results that surpassed even the most optimistic predictions. The strategic situation had been transformed by Maria's campaign. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy had lost more than 80% of their assembled armor strength, with the remaining tanks scattered and disorganized. The planned offensive had been canceled, and enemy forces were now withdrawing from advanced positions in an attempt to consolidate what remained of their strength. The immediate crisis had passed, thanks largely to one pilot's extraordinary skill and courage. But Maria's work was not finished. Reconnaissance flights identified additional targets, smaller concentrations of enemy armor that were trying to regroup and reorganize. Each one represented a potential threat that needed to be eliminated. Maria continued flying missions, attacking tanks wherever they were found, gradually whittling down the enemy's capability until they no longer posed a significant danger. The cumulative toll of her attacks grew steadily. 35 tanks destroyed in one location, 18 in another, 22 more at a third site. Each successful mission added to her reputation and to the enemy's growing fear of the mysterious pilot who seemed able to strike anywhere with devastating accuracy. Some enemy commanders began ordering their tank crews to disperse and hide whenever aircraft were reported in the area, so great was their concern about becoming Maria's next target. As the days passed, the physical and mental strain began to take its toll. Maria flew mission after mission with minimal rest, pushing herself beyond normal human limits. Her hands developed a permanent tremor from the constant strain of controlling the aircraft through violent maneuvers. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from lack of sleep. She lost weight as the stress affected her appetite. But she refused to stop, refused to rest while there were still targets to be struck. Worried about her, could see the exhaustion in her face and the weariness in her movements. He tried to convince her to take a break, to let other pilots handle some of the missions. But Maria would not hear of it. She had developed techniques and skills that were uniquely suited to these precision strikes, and she believed that no one else could achieve the same results. She was probably right, but her determination came at a cost. The ground crew who maintained her aircraft noticed the changes as well. They saw how she would sometimes stand motionless in front of her bomber for long minutes, staring at the machine as if drawing strength from its presence. They heard her talking to herself during pre-flight checks, reviewing procedures and calculations in an endless mental rehearsal. They worried that she was approaching a breaking point, but they also understood that she carried a burden no one else could share. Intelligence officers continued bringing her new targets, each one carefully selected to maximize the strategic impact of her attacks. A tank repair facility where damaged vehicles were being restored to service. A supply depot where ammunition and fuel were stored for armored units. A command post where enemy officers were coordinating what remained of their forces. Maria attacked them all with the same precision and determination that had characterized her earlier missions. The tank repair facility mission was particularly satisfying. Maria caught the enemy with dozens of damaged tanks in various stages of repair, sitting vulnerable and immobile in the facility's maintenance bays. Her bombs destroyed not only the tanks, but also the equipment and expertise needed to repair them. It was a blow from which the enemy's armored capability would take months to recover. The supply depot attack created a spectacular display of pyrotechnics as ammunition stores exploded in a chain reaction that continued for hours. The blast was visible from dozens of miles away, a column of smoke and flame that marked the destruction of supplies that had taken the enemy weeks to accumulate. Without fuel and ammunition, their remaining tanks were little more than expensive metal boxes. The command post strike was the most dangerous mission because it was located in a heavily populated area where civilian casualties were a serious concern. Maria spent days planning the attack. Studying the attack on the command post required a level of precision that exceeded even Maria's previous achievements. She would need to approach the target at a specific angle that would allow her bombs to strike the headquarters building while passing over the adjacent civilian structures. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than yards, and even a slight miscalculation could result in tragedy. Maria flew the mission alone, without in the navigator's position. She made this decision after careful consideration, realizing that the bombing solution would need to be adjusted in real time based on visual observation that only she could make from the pilot's seat. It was a violation of standard procedures, but Maria had long since moved beyond standard procedures into a realm where rules gave way to necessity. She approached the city inn when the streets would be less crowded, but there would still be enough activity to mask her arrival. Flying low over the rooftops, she navigated through the urban landscape with breathtaking precision. Buildings flashed past on either side as she threaded her way toward the target, making constant adjustments to avoid obstacles and maintain the exact flight path required. The headquarters building appeared ahead, a distinctive structure that intelligence had identified through careful analysis of enemy communications patterns. Maria could see people in the streets below, civilians going about their daily lives unaware of the drama unfolding above them. She focused on the target, blocking out everything else, her entire being concentrated on the task of hitting that one building with surgical precision. She released the bombs based on visual cues and instinctive timing developed through hundreds of previous attacks. The weapons fell away, and Maria immediately banked hard to the right, climbing rapidly to clear the urban area. Behind her, the bombs struck the headquarters building with devastating accuracy. The structure collapsed inward, burying the enemy commanders beneath tons of rubble, while the surrounding buildings remained untouched. It was a demonstration of bombing accuracy that military analysts would study for years afterward. As Maria's campaign continued, the cumulative number of tanks she had destroyed approached a milestone that seemed almost impossible. Intelligence officers tallied the confirmed kills from each mission, cross-referencing their counts with reconnaissance photographs and battlefield reports. The numbers told a story of sustained excellence that had no parallel in the history of aerial warfare. 35 tanks destroyed at the bridge target, 22 at the First Valley concentration, 18 in the forested area, 25 in the canyon fortress, 30 in the final compound. The numbers continued to grow with each mission, each successful strike adding to a total that would ultimately reach heights that seemed to belong more to legend than reality. But the physical cost of this sustained campaign was becoming increasingly apparent. Maria's aircraft showed the accumulated damage of dozens of missions, with repairs piled upon repairs until it was difficult to tell which parts were original and which had been replaced. The airframe had been stressed beyond its design limits repeatedly, and cracks were appearing in structural members that should never have failed. Maria herself bore similar signs of accumulated stress. She had lost the ability to sleep for more than a few hours at a time, waking suddenly from nightmares where she saw tanks exploding and heard the sound of anti-aircraft fire. Her hands shook constantly now, not just from physical fatigue, but from nervous exhaustion. She developed a habit of rechecking calculations multiple times, doubting her own skills in ways she never had before. The squadron physician ordered her to take a mandatory rest period, but Maria appealed directly to the commanding general. She argued that the enemy was still reorganizing, still trying to rebuild their armored strength, and that every day she rested was a day they could use to prepare new attacks. The general, recognizing both her dedication and her fragility, agreed to let her continue flying, but assigned a second crew to rotate missions with her. Maria resented the interference at first, feeling that she alone understood the nuances required for these precision strikes. But she gradually came to appreciate the support. The second crew, led by a talented young pilot named Lieutenant, proved capable of executing missions under her guidance, listened carefully to Maria's briefings, absorbed her techniques, and began achieving results that approached her own level of precision. Together, Maria and expanded the scope of the campaign. They attacked targets simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming enemy defenses through coordinated timing. They developed new tactics for attacking heavily defended positions, using one aircraft as a decoy while the other struck from an unexpected angle. The partnership proved so effective that the commanding general authorized the formation of a specialized precision strike unit with Maria as its commander. Under Maria's leadership, the strike unit became a legendary formation within the Air Force. She trained her pilots in the techniques she had developed, teaching them to read terrain, to calculate bombing solutions instinctively, and to fly with the kind of precision that turned aircraft into surgical instruments. Not every pilot could master the skills she taught, but those who did became capable of executing missions that other squadrons considered impossible. The enemy's response to this new threat became increasingly desperate. They tried jamming radio communications, only to find that Maria's pilots navigated by landmarks and instinct rather than electronic aids. They positioned dummy tanks to draw attacks, but Maria taught her pilots to distinguish real armor from decoys through careful observation of tracks, positioning, and supporting equipment. They even attempted to ambush aircraft returning from missions, but Maria's pilots varied their routes and altitudes in ways that made interception nearly impossible. As autumn turned to winter, the strategic situation continued to evolve in favor of the defensive forces. The enemy's armored capability had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, and their ability to launch offensive operations had been severely compromised. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy commanders were now focused primarily on defending their existing positions rather than planning new attacks. Maria flew her final solo mission on a cold December morning when frost covered the ground and her breath formed clouds in the air. The target was a small concentration of tanks that had been assembled near a railway junction, the last significant armored force the enemy had managed to gather. Intelligence estimated perhaps a dozen vehicles, hardly worth the effort of a major strike, but Maria insisted on attacking them personally. She flew the mission with the same meticulous care she had applied to every previous attack. The approach was textbook perfect, the bombing run executed with flawless precision. The tanks exploded in sequence as her bombs found their targets, creating a pattern of destruction that would have been beautiful if not for its deadly purpose. When she turned for home, reconnaissance confirmed that all 12 tanks had been destroyed. That mission brought Maria's confirmed total to a number that shocked even the most optimistic observers. Across all her missions, through months of sustained combat operations, she had destroyed or severely damaged 35 enemy tanks in single attacks, and many more in the cumulative total of her entire campaign. The exact number would be debated by historians for years, with some claiming higher totals and others being more conservative, but no one disputed that she had achieved something extraordinary. The commanding general summoned Maria to headquarters for a ceremony that she tried to avoid, but could not escape. Senior officers from multiple branches of the military gathered to witness her recognition for achievements that had altered the strategic balance of the entire theater of operations. The general read a citation that detailed her missions and their impact, describing how one pilot's exceptional skill had prevented an enemy offensive that could have changed the course of the war. Maria stood at attention during the ceremony, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its necessity. She thought about the tank crews she had killed, men who had probably never seen her aircraft before the bombs struck. She thought about the soldiers whose lives had been saved because those tanks never reached the battlefield. She thought about the cost, both to the enemy and to herself, of the campaign she had waged. When the ceremony ended, Maria requested permission to address the assembled officers. She spoke briefly, but with conviction about the nature of war and the responsibility that came with the ability to inflict such precise destruction. She emphasized that her achievements were not solo accomplishments, but the result of teamwork involving navigators, ground crews, intelligence officers, and the many other people who supported combat operations. She also spoke about the future, expressing her belief that aerial precision would become increasingly important in warfare. She predicted that future conflicts would be decided not by masses of troops or equipment, but by the ability to strike specific targets with surgical accuracy. It was a vision that proved remarkably prescient, though at the time many listeners dismissed it as the idealistic thinking of someone exhausted by combat. After the ceremony, Maria returned to her squadron to find that her aircraft had been retired from service. The accumulation of battle damage and stress had made it unsafe for further operations, and mechanics had determined that repairs would be more expensive than simply obtaining a new bomber. Maria walked around the aircraft one final time, running her hand along the fuselage and remembering the missions they had flown together. The squadron threw a celebration that evening, but Maria slipped away early to walk alone in the darkness. She found herself drawn to the flight line, where rows of aircraft sat silent in the night. She thought about all the missions she had flown, all the targets she had struck, all the impossible shots she had made when others said it could not be done. She thought about the 35 tanks destroyed in single devastating strikes, and the many more eliminated through sustained campaign. But mostly she thought about the command that had started it all, the words spoken in the briefing room when senior officers declared that no pilot could hit the bridge column. They had been wrong, and their error had set in motion a sequence of events that transformed aerial warfare. Maria had proven that with sufficient skill, determination, and courage, even the most impossible targets could be destroyed. The next morning, Maria reported for duty to find new orders waiting. She was being transferred to a training command where she would teach the next generation of pilots the techniques she had developed. It was a recognition of her value beyond the cockpit, an acknowledgement that her knowledge and experience were too important to risk in further combat operations. She accepted the assignment with mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to continue flying missions, to keep fighting until the war was won. But another part recognized that she had pushed herself to the breaking point and that continuing would serve no useful purpose. She had achieved more than anyone had thought possible, had proven points that needed proving, and had made contributions that would be remembered long after the immediate conflict ended. Assumed command of the Precision Strike Unit, and under his leadership it continued the work Maria had begun. The unit's pilots applied the lessons she had taught them. Striking Maria's new role as an instructor brought challenges different from those she had faced in combat, but no less demanding in their own way. Training pilots required patience and the ability to communicate skills that she had developed largely through instinct and experience. She had to break down her techniques into steps that could be taught, to explain the unexplainable, to put into words the split-second decisions that she made without conscious thought. First class of students assigned to her consisted of veteran pilots who had been selected for their demonstrated abilities and their potential to master precision bombing techniques. They arrived expecting to learn from a legend and found instead a quiet, intense woman who seemed uncomfortable with her own fame. Maria began their training not with flying exercises, but with mathematics and physics, teaching them to calculate bombing solutions and understand the forces that affected bombs in flight. Some students struggled with the theoretical material, frustrated by what seemed like academic exercises when they wanted to be in the air. Maria remained patient, explaining that precision bombing began not in the cockpit, but in understanding the fundamental principles that govern their weapons. She showed them calculations from her own missions, demonstrating how tiny errors in initial conditions could produce huge errors in final results. When they finally progressed to flight training, Maria's expectations proved even more demanding than the students had anticipated. She required them to practice approaches again and again, criticizing small deviations from optimal flight paths that other instructors might have ignored. She made them fly through narrow valleys at altitudes that tested their skills and their courage. She pushed them to the edge of their capabilities and then pushed them further. One particular student, a young pilot named Romanov, showed exceptional promise but struggled with confidence. He could execute the required maneuvers perfectly during practice flights, but when faced with simulated combat conditions, he would hesitate, second-guessing his decisions at critical moments. Maria recognized the problem immediately because she had seen it in herself during her early combat missions. She took aside one evening and shared with him something she had never told anyone else. She explained that during her first precision bombing mission, she had experienced such severe doubt that she almost aborted the attack. She had wondered whether she was truly capable of hitting the target, whether her reputation was deserved, whether she would fail when it mattered most. But she had pushed through the doubt, had trusted her training and her preparation, and had succeeded. The conversation transformed his approach to flying. He stopped overthinking his decisions and started trusting his instincts. Within weeks, he had become one of the most promising students in the class, executing precision attacks with a smoothness that reminded Maria of her own flying style. She felt a deep satisfaction in watching him develop, knowing that her knowledge and experience were being passed on to someone who would carry them forward. As the training program expanded, Maria developed a comprehensive curriculum that covered every aspect of precision bombing. She taught her students to read terrain from aerial photographs, to identify the subtle clues that distinguished real targets from decoys, to calculate wind drift and adjust for turbulence, to fly aircraft at the absolute limits of their performance envelopes. She shared every technique she had developed, every lesson she had learned, holding nothing back. The success of her training program led to requests from other Air Force units for similar instruction. Maria found herself traveling between bases, conducting seminars and demonstrations for pilots who wanted to learn her methods. She discovered that she enjoyed teaching more than she had expected, finding satisfaction in watching others master skills that had once seemed impossible. But the war continued, and Maria could not entirely escape its pull. Intelligence reports still crossed her desk, detailing enemy movements and identifying potential targets. She found herself analyzing these reports automatically, planning attacks that she would never fly, thinking through solutions to tactical problems that other pilots would have to solve. Part of her would always be a combat pilot, even when she was standing in front of a classroom. Occasionally, urgent situations arose that required her personal attention. When reconnaissance identified an exceptionally difficult target that threatened Allied positions, commanders sometimes requested that Maria come out of training duties to lead the attack herself. She always refused these requests, explaining that her students needed to handle such missions if the training was to have any meaning. She would help plan the attacks, would brief the pilots who would fly them, but she would not take the controls herself. One such mission involved a heavily defended bridge that the enemy was using to move supplies to their forward positions. The bridge was located in a narrow gorge similar to the one where Maria had achieved her first spectacular success. The parallels were obvious to everyone, and there was strong pressure for her to lead the attack personally. But Maria assigned the mission to, trusting him to apply the lessons she had taught. Studied the target with the same intensity Maria had brought to her own missions. He planned his approach carefully, calculated his bombing solution precisely, and briefed his crew with meticulous attention to detail. When he flew the mission, he executed it flawlessly, destroying the bridge with a precision that evoked memories of Maria's legendary attack. It was proof that her techniques could be learned, that precision bombing was not dependent on one exceptional pilot, but could become a standard capability of properly trained crews. News of success spread quickly, and Maria felt a pride that surpassed anything she had experienced during her own combat missions. She had created something that would outlast her individual contributions, a training program and a body of knowledge that would continue producing skilled pilots long after she retired from service. It was a legacy that mattered more than any personal achievement. As months passed, the strategic situation continued to evolve. The enemy's armored forces never recovered from the losses Maria had inflicted, and without that capability, they could not mount the kind of offensive operations that had threatened to break through the defensive lines. The war gradually shifted from desperate defense to cautious counteroffensive as Allied forces exploited the weakness created by Maria's campaign. Historians and military analysts began studying Maria's missions, trying to understand how one pilot had achieved such extraordinary results. They examined flight records, interviewed crew members, analyzed bomb damage assessments, and constructed detailed timelines of her campaign. What emerged was a picture of sustained excellence that had no parallel in the history of aerial warfare. The analysis revealed several factors that contributed to Maria's success. Her exceptional flying skills were obvious, but equally important was her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, her meticulous attention to detail during mission planning, her willingness to develop new tactics when standard procedures proved inadequate, and her capacity to learn from each mission and apply those lessons to future attacks. But analysts also noted elements that could not be easily or replicated. Maria possessed an intuitive understanding of bombing solutions that went beyond mathematical calculation. She could read terrain and weather conditions in ways that informed her tactical decisions at levels she herself could not fully articulate. She had developed a kind of combat instinct that allowed her to make correct choices even when she lacked complete information. These qualities made her an exceptional combat pilot, but they also made her a challenging instructor. How could she teach intuition? How could she transfer instincts that she had developed through experience to students who lacked that experience? Maria grappled with these questions throughout her time as an instructor, eventually concluding that the best she could do was create the conditions under which her students could develop their own intuitions and instincts. The number of tanks Maria had destroyed became a topic of considerable debate. Official records credited her with 35 tanks destroyed in the bridge column attack and subsequent precision strikes, but this number was based solely on confirmed kills where reconnaissance photos or ground reports could verify the destruction. Many military historians believed the actual total was significantly higher when accounting for tanks damaged beyond repair, vehicles destroyed in secondary explosions, and targets struck where confirmation was impossible. Some estimates placed Maria's total as high as 200 tanks destroyed or rendered combat ineffective across all her missions. Others were more conservative, sticking to officially confirmed numbers while acknowledging that the true total would never be known with certainty. What no one disputed was that Maria's campaign had destroyed or damaged a significant portion of the enemy's armored capability at a critical moment in the war. The story of how command said no pilot could hit the bridge column, only to have Maria destroy it along with 35 enemy tanks, became legendary within military aviation circles. It was repeated in training courses, cited in tactical manuals, and used as an example of how individual skill and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The story grew in the telling, with details added and embellished until it was sometimes difficult to separate fact from legend. Maria herself was uncomfortable with the mythology that grew around her achievements. She insisted that she had simply done her job, that any skilled pilot with proper training and preparation could have achieved similar results. This modesty only enhanced her reputation, making her seem even more remarkable for her refusal to claim special status. As the war entered its final phase, Maria received word that she was being considered for the highest military honors her nation could bestow. The recognition would acknowledge not just her combat achievements, but also her contributions to military aviation through her training programs and tactical innovations. She tried to decline the honor, arguing that it should go to pilots still engaged in active combat. But her objections were overruled by senior commanders who understood the importance of recognizing exceptional achievement. The award ceremony took place in the capital city, attended by government officials, military leaders, and representatives from allied nations. Maria wore her dress uniform, decorated with medals from previous recognitions, and stood at attention while a senior official read the citation describing her accomplishments. The audience listened in respectful silence as the citation detailed missions that seemed to belong more to fiction than reality. When the ceremony concluded, Maria was surrounded by reporters wanting to interview her about her experiences. She answered their questions politely but briefly, deflecting attention from herself toward the crews who had supported her missions and the students who were carrying forward the techniques she had developed. She spoke about the importance of precision in modern warfare and her belief that future conflicts would be decided by accuracy rather than overwhelming force. One reporter asked Maria what she considered her greatest achievement. She paused before answering, considering the question carefully. Finally, she said that her greatest achievement was not any single mission or number of tanks destroyed, but rather the knowledge that she had trained pilots who would continue the work she had begun. The reporter pressed her about the bridge column mission, about the moment when she proved that what command said was impossible could actually be accomplished. Maria smiled slightly and explained that the bridge column had never been impossible. It had been difficult, certainly, and it had required skills that most pilots had not developed. But impossible was a word that should be used sparingly, because it discouraged people from attempting things that might actually be achievable with sufficient dedication and preparation. She had approached the bridge column mission the same way she approached every challenge in her life, by breaking it down into manageable components and mastering each component through practice and study. After the ceremony, Maria returned to her duties as an instructor, finding comfort in the familiar routine of teaching and training. She continued refining her curriculum, incorporating lessons learned from recent missions flown by her graduates. She maintained correspondence with pilots serving in operational squadrons, offering advice and encouragement as they faced new challenges. Years later, when the war finally ended, Maria remained in military service, rising through ranks to positions of increasing responsibility. She helped establish the doctrine for precision bombing that would guide her nation's air force for decades. She served on committees that evaluated new aircraft designs and weapon systems. She mentored young officers who would eventually become senior commanders themselves. But she never forgot the missions she had flown, the targets she had struck, the impossible shots that she had made. The memory of flying through narrow valleys with anti-aircraft fire exploding around her, of lining up on targets that others considered too difficult to hit, of that moment when bombs released and she could only wait to see if her calculations had been correct, these memories stayed with her always. The bridge column remained her most famous achievement, the mission that had started everything. When command said no pilot could hit that column, they had meant it as a statement of fact based on their understanding of what was possible. Maria had transformed their understanding, had shown that the limits of possibility were further than they had imagined. And in proving them wrong about the bridge column, she had opened the door to a campaign that destroyed 35 enemy tanks in concentrated strikes, and many more across the full scope of her operations. Maria eventually retired from active service, but her influence on military aviation continued long after she left the cockpit. The pilots she trained went on to train others, creating a lineage of precision bombing expertise that spread throughout the Air Force. The techniques she developed became standard procedures taught in flight schools. The missions she flew were studied in war colleges as examples of tactical excellence. In her later years, Maria occasionally gave lectures at military academies, sharing her experiences with new generations of pilots. She spoke about the importance of preparation, about the need to remain calm under pressure, about the value of questioning assumptions, and testing the boundaries of what people believed was possible. She emphasized that her achievements had not resulted from natural talent alone, but from countless hours of practice, study, and dedication to mastering her craft. When asked about the psychological toll of combat, about the weight of knowing that her bombs killed people, Maria answered honestly. She explained that she had struggled with these questions throughout her career and had never found completely satisfactory answers. War was a terrible thing that destroyed lives and inflicted suffering on both combatants and civilians. But when war came, it had to be fought, and she believed it should be fought with as much precision as possible to minimize unnecessary destruction. The final count of tanks destroyed by Maria's campaign remained uncertain, with different sources citing different totals. But whether the number was 35 or 200, whether it included only confirmed direct hits or encompassed all vehicles rendered combat ineffective, the strategic impact was undeniable. Maria had changed the course of the war, had prevented an enemy offensive that could have altered history, had demonstrated capabilities that transformed how military leaders thought about aerial warfare. She lived long enough to see precision-guided weapons become standard equipment in modern air forces, to see the development of technologies that made accurate bombing routine rather than exceptional. These advances validated her belief that warfare was evolving toward greater precision, but they also made her slightly sad. She had flown in an era when precision required exceptional human skill, when the difference between success and failure came down to a pilot's abilities rather than electronic systems. Maria passed away peacefully many years after the war ended, surrounded by family and former students who had gathered to pay their respects. News of her death was reported internationally, with obituaries describing her as one of the most skilled combat pilots in history. Military ceremonies honored her contributions, and scholars began the work of compiling comprehensive accounts of her career. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from a group of her former students who gathered at the site where the bridge column had once stood. They placed a memorial marker describing the mission that had started Maria's legendary campaign, the attack that proved a single pilot with exceptional skill could accomplish what entire squadrons might fail to achieve. The marker bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of Maria's legacy. Command said no pilot could hit that column. She destroyed it and 35 enemy tanks, proving that impossible is just a word we use before someone shows us it can be done throughout the theater with increasing effectiveness. They never quite matched Maria's level of precision, but they came close enough to maintain the pressure on enemy forces and prevent any recovery of armored capability and maps to identify the precise building where enemy commanders had established their headquarters. She would need to hit that specific structure while avoiding the surrounding buildings occupied by civilians zoped over her career. The aircraft banked hard through tight turns, scraping past rocky outcroppings with meters to spare. She flew by instinct and feel, reading the terrain ahead and making split-second decisions about the safest path forward. Sat white-knuckled in his seat, trusting Maria's flying completely while focusing on his navigation duties. Counted down the final seconds, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Maria's world contracted to a single point of focus, every fiber of her being concentrated on maintaining the exact flight path required for success. The anti-aircraft fire intensified, creating a steel curtain through which they had to fly, but she never wavered.